Secondly, God loves us unconditionally. He loves us greatly, and he loves us unconditionally. Notice the end of verse 6. Paul says, "For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly." It does not say that when we were without strength, Christ died for the godly. He did not die for the innocent or for the deserving or for the lovable. He died for the ungodly, the undeserving, the guilty, sinners, his enemies. And why would he do that? And the only explanation is this, that God's love for us is not conditional. He does not love us. He did not die for us because of something in us that drew him to us. He does not love us because of us, but in spite of us. It's unconditional. And I think that this form of love, this unconditional love, it is a holy love. It is a love that is completely and totally alien to anything that you have ever experienced anywhere else. It's not the way that men love. It's holy. It's different. It's not anything we've ever seen. Look at verse 7. Paul says, "For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." In other words, Paul says, "For scarcely for a righteous man will one die." That is, scarcely, very rarely will you find a man willing to die for another man because that man is righteous, because he is, principled, just, law-abiding, perhaps meaning admirable. Paul says it's very rare that you'll find a man willing to die for someone like that. He says, "But yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die." I think by good he means someone who's particularly benevolent, someone who is generous, caring, perhaps a very lovable person. Perhaps for that kind of person, someone would even dare to die. In other words, you might be able to find someone able to emulate the greatness of God's love in that he would be willing to die for another. Not that any man has ever given up the life that Christ gave or died the death that he died, but you could possibly find a man willing to die for another. But Paul's point here is that God's love for us is not only great in magnitude, but of a whole other category altogether. It's a different form of love. It's in a different category. It says, "But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." And now to really understand what this is saying, the first thing we need to see is we need to understand what God thinks of sinners. Because it would be one thing to think God died for sinners because he's fairly neutral or indifferent towards sin. And, if we were to go to our culture, the culture talks about unconditional love, and by it, they mean, taking delight in another person for who they are, no matter who they are. It's talking about delighting in someone. And when the Bible talks about God's love for sinners, that is not what it means. And I think it may be helpful just to realize that there are two primary senses in which we use the word love. We use the word love first in that sense of we delight in someone. Maybe it's your friend, maybe it's a romantic interest, whatever. It's someone that you enjoy, someone you delight in, someone you like. But there's a second sense in which we use the word love, and we mean to desire good for someone. When mom or dad has their son and are about to give him a spanking and they say, "Son, I love you." That's what they mean. Or when you're going, you're driving down the street and you see a homeless man, asking for money, and your heart goes out to them. It's that kind of love, that desiring good for someone, not delighting in, desiring their good. And that's the kind of love that God has unconditionally for sinners. But you see, you also need to recognize that the way that God looks at your sin, that your sin is revolting to God, that God hates sin. He hates it. And the reason God's wrath burns towards sin is not because he is a God of wrath, but because he loves righteousness. And sin is an attack, an aberration of righteousness. And it is God's love for righteousness that motivates his hatred for sin. And just think about for a moment the fact that your sin incenses God to such an extent that without Christ, God would have cast you into hell forever and ever. And his wrath, after an eternity upon eternity, still would not run cold. That is the measure of God's hatred for sin. And yet, he loves you more. Yet his love for you, his determination to do you good, is so great that in spite of that, he has even chosen to send his own son to die for you, to save you. That is unconditional love, and that is holy love. It is alien to anything that we have ever experienced.